Hey, my name is Beau. I'm a musician and music teacher, and in today's video, we are going to talk about harmonic audiation. What is it? Why do you want to develop it? And how to develop it? So the punchline here is that when we are playing music, it most of the time is existing in some kind of harmonic context. So we could be in major or minor or Dorian or something like that. But even within an actual mode or tonality, we tend to hear a harmonic function. So for example, if I play, if I take away the melody, we get this. That could be one possible harmonic accompaniment to playing. Now, right off the bat, we want to make a distinction between audiation and just plunking keys on an instrument. And so this can seem like a trite distinction, but it can actually be a humongous problem that musicians have. So for example, some musicians, they can play chords on a piano or a guitar, and it sounds good when they're playing, but when they listen to another musician or a recording play chords, they really have no idea what's going on. Now, in a lot of cases, people just treat this as an ear training problem. So they treat playing the instrument as one thing, physically being able to play the instrument as one thing, and that other skill that I'm talking about being a separate thing. Now, I would recommend you actually not separate those in your mind. So this just requires a different way of looking at what music is, how it's performed, and this is why this word audiation tends to be so useful. Audiation means to understand music in context with meaning, just like you would understand someone speak a language. So right now, you're getting hit with a lot of different words. If you are fluent in the language of English, you will understand the context of what I'm saying. You will understand the individual points that I'm making. Now, the same thing happens with music. When we hear just random sounds being played, they don't have musical meaning. Most likely not. But when we hear tones that essentially make more sense, it's not even just the instrument that's making sense, it's our brain's ability to unravel this into meaning and give us this kind of first-person experience of understanding music. And that's what the word audiation is pointing at. The word audiation really means to understand music at this kind of deep intuitive level, like you would understand your first language. And so when we're talking about audiating chord progressions, I mean, what are we really talking about? And that example I gave before about how some musicians can play chords on an instrument, but they're not really audiating chords. And that's simply because just pushing buttons down on an instrument doesn't really activate audiation in and of itself. So, and then this is where it gets difficult to detect what's going on in your own playing if you're not familiar with this. When you play a chord progression on your instrument, can you actually hear that in your mind and understand what's going on in your mind? Not in music theory language. I don't mean, do you know if it's a tonic chord or a dominant chord or anything like that? I just mean, do you recognize it? If I played this, do you know what I'm playing? And it's a fascinating subject to get into if you did not grow up playing music or if you did not learn music with any kind of ear training or audiation training. There can be a gigantic gap in your ability to actually audiate the things you can even physically execute on your instrument. Now, how do you learn harmonic audiation? And in my kind of thinking process, I split harmonic audiation into three things. There's melodic, there's the melodic component, there's kind of the blocked component, and then there's you could call it the root motion or the bass melody or the root melody, any one of those three things. So when we're talking about learning how to effectively audiate harmony, we really need three separate skills. And what's really fascinating about this as well is that some people can have really advanced abilities in one or two of these and suffer really big deficits in the other two. So let me give you an example of each one of these. So the melodic component of harmony is really important. If I played a melody like this, are you able to read between the lines and understand the chord progression that I just played through? I'm in the key of C here, but it sounds like I'm playing a C chord. And then I'm hinting at an F chord. And then maybe landing on a C chord again. And so what we need to be able to navigate this aspect of music, the melodic aspect of music, and have a harmonic understanding is we have to have these things stored as patterns. And this is something that the music education researcher Edwin E. Gordon talked a lot about, but he called them tonal patterns. You could think about them almost as like arpeggiated chord progressions. We need to be able to, at some point, have these in our memory so we can use them while we're playing. We use them while we're playing other people's music. We use them while we're writing music. We use them while we're improvising. We use them to recognize what other people are doing. If you have this in your vocabulary and someone else plays this in a tune, it's very likely that you can kind of read between the lines and understand what they're doing quite rapidly and quite effortlessly. So that's one component of developing harmonic audiation, is having a storehouse of these melodic patterns. And I don't mean stuff like this. I don't mean arpeggios that kind of just go on forever and ever. I mean really short, like 2, 3, or 4 note little ideas. And the way that you develop that, and one of the ways you can develop it, the way that I prefer, is by taking a small chord progression, maybe like 1, 5, 1, 5, and learning a set of little tonal patterns or arpeggios that cover that. So we could do something like this. And what I would do is I would play that on an instrument or listen to it on a recording and sing it back. And eventually I want to get to the point where I have this thing memorized, and this starts to just be a little bit of a foundation in vocabulary. Now, once the set of patterns is memorized, we can do all kinds of crazy stuff with it. We can improvise. And that's a very valuable exercise, but that's how it's built. And what tends to happen, again, once the patterns are memorized and they're in your vocabulary, you start just understanding what other people are playing very quickly and very rapidly. And that's kind of a hallmark of audiation. That's one of the stages of audiation where you know something so well, when you hear something you don't know, you have a storehouse of patterns to compare it to, and you understand what's going on. So that's just a little bit of a take on how you work on the first component. You work on things in chord progressions, and you need to commit them to memory. It gets a little more detailed than that, but that's really the meat of it. Now, the second point here on our chart is to understand the harmony when it's played as a full block. So if I do this chord progression again, I could play those little patterns as a chord. That's kind of what I'm hearing in an underlying fashion. And now this is a really important skill to develop. So if you are in any kind of band that plays chords, which is virtually going to be every kind of music conceivable, you're going to want this ability where when someone else plays a chord progression, you can kind of just unravel it in terms of its meaning. You hear this? Okay, that was 1, 4, 1. Okay, that was 1 and then a 2 chord with a dominant 7 flavor, however you want to name it theoretically. I'm not really talking about the theory. The theory can be added on to what we're doing, but I'm talking about just a really raw understanding where you hear something and immediately know what it is. Now, a very useful way to practice this part of harmonic audiation is to make yourself little recordings where you compare two progressions that are very, very close to each other. So for example, if I was going to do, here's a great example. I could do C, A minor, D minor to G. Listen to that a couple times. Now I could compare that with C to A to D minor to G. Again, the original. The new one. And what I would do, I would make myself a recording or make a recording for a student where I constantly keep going back and forth between the two, and I call out what it is. This is the one with the A minor. This is the one with the A7. And then later in the recording, I just play them in random orders. I might do the first one 2 or 3 times, and then the other one. And I go back and forth. And I'm trying to give the learner, which could be myself or a student, the chance to really just recognize it by ear. Now, when you make these little recordings, you can make them very short. They can be a minute, 2 or 3 minutes. I like to keep them on the short side. And you work on them for a week or two. If they're complicated, you can work on them for even like a month might be a good idea. But just a handful of times a week, it could be 3, 4, or 5 times a week for a few minutes in each session. And over the period of weeks and like a month, you'll really be able to rapidly recognize what's going on. And now in terms of a bit of strategy, don't make 50 of these recordings at once. It's too much for the ear to learn. You make a couple each week, and then over the course of a year, you really incrementally grow this and you grow your harmonic vocabulary. And I'll touch on that a little bit in the end of the video, but that's a really important point. So the third component of harmonic audiation and how to develop it is by learning the root melodies, which it's not always, or learning the bass line I would even more prefer, because the chords don't always need to have the root in them. It could be something else. It could be. But basically, when we learn a chord progression and we really are trying to audiate it in its entirety, we want to take advantage of bass notes because they often give away what's being played. For example, this is a very cliche line. So if you listen to the bass line, bum, 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 or bum, bum, bum. Now, because that is a piece of vocabulary in and of itself, when I hear that as a bass line, it can do the heavy lifting and I can figure out what's going on without even really having to listen to the rest of the progression. And this is an important distinction about the first two parts here. Or sorry, the second two parts. When we're learning to identify progressions with the roots or the bass notes, that is a separate skill than being able to identify a progression with just hearing the chords in any kind of weird inversion. So for example, we might be able to recognize like a 1-6-2-5 when it's played in root position, because we've memorized that bass line. Bum, 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 bum. And it kind of gives away the progression. But it's a different skill to be able to recognize that chord progression when there is no bass line that's very apparent. So if I play the chords in inversions, that's a completely separate skill. And so this is why I have them as two separate skills here. So when I'm talking about working on chords in a blocked formation, I'm not always playing them in root position. And in fact, I actually want to be able to develop the ability to tell what the flavor of the chord is, what the function is in the progression without relying on the bass note. So we separate these two. And the same thing goes for the bass lines. You want to sing them, commit them to memory, just like with the first two, and you can make little recordings where you compare two progressions. So you could compare, like, you could record a 1-4-5. You could go versus a 1-5-4. And just making recordings where you constantly kind of quiz yourself, it forces your ears to try to figure out what's going on. And so that really covers the three components. The practical side of it, when you're actually trying to do this with yourself, because this can be done on your own. I do this with my students and I send my students recordings, but I am doing this to myself with progressions that I want to learn to audiate better. And the name of the game is to really just take it slow and do it incrementally. One of the things I like to do is take a couple progressions that I'm going to work on for a few weeks. And so I say, okay, I'm working on, you know, this tritone sub or this jazz progression, this thing that I really want to get in my ear. And I'm going to make a 2 or 3 minute recording that might highlight one of these aspects or all three. And I'm going to listen to it a lot, you know, every day for a couple minutes for probably, it could be 3, 4, 5 days a week. It's not bad to take a break a little bit. And I'll keep that going for like a month. And as I listen to that more and more, it will really get stamped on my mind. The thing that people struggle with, and this is why I see people fail with this, people are in such a rush to add more and more content, they don't master a couple things and they gloss over things. But if you think about your development over the next couple of years or over the next 5 years, if you just added 1 or 2 new chords, so functions, so, you know, the 2 chord, the 3 chord, the 5 of 5, the 2-5 of 3, whatever the progression is, it doesn't matter. If you just added one or two of those to your ear, maybe let's say 3 a month, right? I mean, over the course of years, you would really have a strong harmonic foundation, because quite frankly, a lot of people can't even hear 1-4-5 very well, even if they're playing in bands or they're writing music. There's a real severe deficit of this skill out there in the wild. And if you just master, a handful of things, 20 progressions a year, 30 progressions a year, I mean, in 5 years, you can really tackle the music in your genre. And that's an important point. If I like starting people with 1, 4, and 5, but depending on the genre that you're interested in, whatever you do after that is best to tailor towards your goals. So if you want to be a jazz musician, learn 1, 4, and 5. That you got to start there in major and minor. But after that, you might start doing some tritone subs or some 2-5-1s that point to other points in the key. But if you're a blues musician, that might not be where you start. If you're a blues musician, maybe you learn how to play like the 5 of 2 is really common for blues musicians to play, or just different kinds of progressions that are more common in that genre. If you're a classical musician, there's certain progressions that tend to be more common. And after you've learned to audiate 1, 4, 5 in these different ways, you're going to make a choice to where to go next depending on your goals. But my point here is that each genre tends to not have a complete tidal wave of harmonic information. I will say there's a lot in jazz to do, but it's kind of finite in the sense that the fundamentals that you need to get online to be able to play over basic jazz standards and show up to a jam session, you don't need to master everything. And there's a core set of things that is worth mastering. And this does not take 10 years to do. If you do it properly, you can do it really well. In a year, you can get a lot done, but in a couple of years, you could virtually be a professional at this. But again, the reason that people struggle with the learning curve here is that in the beginning, it's very slow. Just to get your ear online with 1, 4, or 5, it feels kind of like a slow, just going through the trenches. But what starts happening after you have 1, 4, and 5 in your ear, the thing just takes off, and more progressions will get into your ear faster. And so, you don't always have to start with like 1 progression a month. As you get more advanced, it kind of speeds up. But in the beginning, you take it slow and you'll get more out of it. So again, my name is Beau. I'm a musician and music teacher. I teach piano and guitar online. I also teach people just to audiate better. Many of my students already have teachers in terms of their instrument, but they come to me to really get their ears together so they can learn to improvise better, learn to compose better, even just learn to play the instrument better. If you can audiate better, it'll really translate to your instrument. So if you're interested, in the description of this video, you'll find my website and an email. You can reach out to me, shoot me an email. If you have any questions or comments or ideas of your own, hit a comment down below. I love talking about this stuff. Thanks so much. Have a wonderful day.